welcome to Opera Notes. And today we
Mm-hmm.
have the big pleasure of having with us Australian composer Lee Bradshaw. This is quite a surprise for us here in Opera Notes, because we never thought that we would be able to interview the composer who has written the first grand opera completely sung in Arabic with a Middle Eastern story, right? Mr. Bradshaw, if you want to tell us a bit about how this came to be, because it was a secret for the rest of the world, right? It's something that we just found out very recently. So tell us how did this adventure started, please.
It really is quite extraordinary. I'm sorry to hear that it was a secret. I don't think that was really anybody's intention, but you know, because everything seemed to come together so quickly, including the promotion of the opera. I guess not everybody knew what was happening, and certainly in my own country here in Australia, nobody knew about it apart from the people who know me. So, but in terms of our involvement, we originally became involved in this project probably in early to mid 2022 is when we really seriously started discussing it, and we had a copy of the poetic treatment of the story, which was written by Saleh Zamanan, who was a Saudi poet. It was certainly at that stage the Ministry of Culture's understanding that this was a libretto. I had been told that there had been others who had attempted to get an opera started with this document, and my first comment was, the story's amazing. It's perfect for opera. It's full of drama. The characters are really almost like the embodiment of human archetypes come crashing together. So it's a perfect story for opera, but it was extremely long. And my first course of action was to reduce the length of this document and present it back to the ministry and say, I think if we're going to make this into an opera, this is the format that that the document needs to be in as a starting point for us to really turn it into a libretto that can be set operatically. I had to explain to them that, and I used the example of one of the choruses in Beethoven's Fidelio, that, you know, you can have a 3-minute chorus with, you know, 4 words. So, you know, in opera, things tend to happen over a longer period of time because music is linear, and whilst the poetic document originally was, again, like very detailed and very beautiful and layers of complexity, you know, opera being a 360-degree storytelling mechanism, it doesn't all need to be in the text. So that was really our starting point. That was the very first meeting that we had, the very first time we went with our team to Saudi Arabia to talk about the project. And of course, initially it was met with some resistance because, you know, they don't know us and we don't know them, and it was an interesting way to start I suppose, to negotiate our way around a working relationship. But I stayed there for about a month and spent time with Saleh, which was great. And we really developed a good working relationship and developed a bond with one another of trust. I think it was very important for him to realize that I understood the complexity and the symbology that was in his story, because he asked me a few very sort of pointed questions about, when this happens, what do you think it means? And of course, I just answered exactly the way that I felt, and it just so happened that my understanding of of what he had in the story was accurate, at least from his perspective. And so I think that helped us with the trust creatively between us. And from that point, it really became quite smooth sailing from a creative perspective. And I was able to go ahead and start setting it operatically. Prior to that point, you know, I'd made a few small musical notes, motivic ideas and things like that, but I wasn't really able to start until I knew that I could do what I needed to do with that poetry to set it operatically.
You basically have no knowledge of Arabic, right? Or previous knowledge of the language.
And honestly, if you ask me now, I feel like I know less about Arabic than I did.
So how did you manage to write for the language? Forget about the voice, for the language. How do you manage to become acquainted with its nuances and its accents?
The main thing for me was to make sure that I had all the resources that I needed. So obviously we had, I mean, the first question when the idea came to me initially was, you know, do you want to write an opera? Yes, of course. Ask any composer. Yes. There's a catch. It's in Arabic. I went, okay, well, I'm pretty sure Arabic goes right to left. So is that going to be an issue? So we discovered that there was a Latinized version of the language, which goes left to right. So that was one hurdle that was cleared initially. But then, of course, reading it off the page, even Latinized, doesn't give you a proper understanding of the pronunciation. Sometimes the way that a word appears on paper, it seems to have more or less syllables than it sounds like it does. So I needed to have the whole document recorded into audio by a local Saudi speaker. So we did that. And when I was in Riyadh for the first time, I sat down with a local and she recorded every word of the document for me. And I categorized it into every different character entry. Then I sent that to my assistant here in Australia, who is an ex-operatic soprano who is an educator now. But she was helping me just, I suppose, from a dramaturgical perspective, she helped me in reducing the size of the document. But because she had been a singer previously, and as you know, operatic singers train in many languages, and one of the tools that they use is phoneticization of language that they don't speak in. So she went ahead and actually respelled the entire document phonetically for me. So I had the Latin, I had the audio, and I had the phonetics. And then on top of that, I went through with the audio and I did a basic rhythmic dictation of the whole thing, mainly because when I heard the poetry spoken, I noticed a real rhythmic musical quality to the poetry. And I thought that's got to be in the bloodlines of the music. It's got to be there from the very beginning. So I wanted that, but also from a practical perspective, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't inserting 8 bars of rest in the middle of a word or something stupid like that. So with all of those assets, I felt that I was able to start. And then, of course, it's checking and checking again and checking again and checking again. And as I was working through the setting, there would be times where there were particular lines of text that I felt were extraneous and were unnecessary, so I would cut them. But then, of course, once you make cuts, sometimes that can potentially change the meaning of what's left behind. So again, it's about checking. And I was very fortunate to be working with a wonderful collaborator, Dr. Khalid Amin in Morocco, who turns out was Saleh Zamanan's professor many, many years ago. And Khalid actually has a specialty in British theatre, funnily enough. So he was really helpful in terms of when I needed to take something out, he could advise me whether or not that was going to affect the meaning of the poetry. And so I always had that resource to fall back on, as well as many other people that we were just dealing with regularly in Saudi, that if I needed to ask questions, I could. So I didn't feel like I was completely in isolation on that front. And of course, if I was dealing with any language, I mean, I only speak English. I have a small grasp of Italian because most musicians do. But if I was working even in Italian and certainly any other language aside from English, I'd probably have to approach it very much the same way. And I think that was part of what gave the ministry some confidence in what we were doing, was that I was able to explain to them how I was going to deal with their language. And I think that helped a lot.
Okay. Now, Western composers, for example, when writing music for movies or now Netflix series, right, the internet,
Sure.
when dealing with the Middle East, when characterizing the Middle East, are accused of using Orientalisms. So how do you avoid using Orientalisms in Zarqa?
Well, I don't believe that I did, but obviously it's not entirely for me to comment on. I was certainly aware of that trap, and I'll answer that question in two parts. The first part was it wasn't, and it hasn't, and I don't believe I did. It certainly was not my intention ever to try and write Arabic music, because I'm not an Arab. That would be completely absurd and inappropriate of me to suggest that that's what I was doing. And I made that very clear from the outset, that I'm an Australian. I was born in this country. I have Eastern European heritage and heritage from Britain. That's my background. My influences from a musical perspective obviously have a strong Central European influence because of being a classically trained musician. And I most strongly resonate, I suppose, with the ethnic music of Eastern Europe, which anthropologically can be sort of drawn. You can draw some lines back into the Middle East, of course. So I was very clear about that, and I said, I'm going to write music that I write. What I want to do is I want to take an influence of music from this region. And so the first time I was in Saudi, I said to the people at the ministry, I said to the folks that we were dealing with at the logistics company and at the commission, I said, give me everything you got. I don't want to hear pop music. I'm very aware of I mean, there's a huge scene in the Middle East of pop music, which is heavily influenced by, I suppose, what's happening, particularly in LA, in America, but with some elements of folk music that's basically morphed together with just West Coast pop. I don't need to hear that. I've heard plenty of that. I want traditional and anything. Saudi Arabia itself has something like 300 tribes, and every single one of them has their own distinct musical culture. And, you know, this is not, it's not feasible or possible for me to, in a lifetime, even to come close to understanding all of that music. What I noticed, though, and I listened to a lot, I mean, a lot, as much as one can in a short period of time, I started to notice, of course, within all of the different musical dialects that I was being exposed to, there were certain similarities that were present amongst all of them. And of course, to sit there and try and differentiate the distinctions would be one thing, but what I was being drawn to were the things, the similarities that were tying all those different dialects together, and the elements in those similarities which were already present in my own musical language or vernacular. And I mentioned before about having that sort of Eastern European influence in my own voice. There are certain intervals that are again, really that were present, and those intervals that would influence certain kinds of harmony, they were already there in my own voice. So they were the kind of things that I were hearing in the Arabic music that I was attracted to. And I'm very instinctive. I thought early on that I would try and incorporate some kind of academic approach, and I went searching, and I asked people at the Ministry of Culture if there was any literature about traditional Arabic music, and it turns out that the most thorough treatise, I suppose, for want of a better expression, on traditional music from that region was written by a British guy in the 1920s or early 20th century. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to go there. I'm just, I've got two ears. I can listen myself. And so that was really my process, was listen, 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 listen. And I just found that I was being attracted to certain sounds that moved me. And I guess because they moved me, the fact that I found them already present in my own voice was what I was going to lean into. And so I felt that I could fairly comfortably write as naturally as I would any other work, and just keeping in mind some of those sounds. But there's also a spirit in Arabic music which I guess I've tried to capture or incorporate or let be an influence as well. Certain rhythmic things, but it really wasn't an academic exercise in any way, shape, or form. And look, a particularly cynical person might point out parts of the score that they could accuse of being Oriental sounding. Again, not for me to say. What I can tell you is that when the Saudis and broadly speaking Arabic people heard the music for the first time, they were very happy. So
very happy. Okay. So the reception was very positive the day of the premiere, right?
The reception was overwhelming. I mean, you're a composer, no matter how good you feel about something that you've written. I mean, from my point of view, I write music. My objective is to create work that an audience can use. That's something I've been saying for a long time. And what I mean by that is whether it's a musician or whether it's an audience, everybody that hears music is an audience to music. Something that they can use means it's something that that can move them and that can make them feel something. And so that's always been an objective of mine since I was a kid, I guess. And so to see the work performed and to see people visibly moved night after night after night, and really, and to be approached by so many people who didn't know me. And you know what that's like when you have a work performed and a complete stranger will go out of their way and that they're visibly emotional to tell you that your work moved them. I mean, that's a huge thing. So we saw a lot of that, and it was incredibly gratifying just from a creative perspective. But given all of the other factors that were a part of this, the fact that this was the first opera, the fact that it was their language being sung operatically for the first time, and something that a lot of people in Saudi never ever thought that they would see, let alone be a part of. So there was a lot of things that I think contributed to why it was such an emotional experience for many people. And I know that that the music was very moving for many of them. So
Now, the late British composer Alexander Gower once said that a composer writes an opera, and then when the time comes around to produce the piece, then the composer becomes nothing more than a fly on the wall. It doesn't have an input, right? And into what happens with the production, etc., etc.
sure.
In your case, as this was the first time an opera was being produced in Saudi Arabia, did you actually have an input into the development of the theatrical production of the piece?
To a certain extent, we had Daniele Finzi-Pasca was our director, and he assembled an incredible array of wonderful artists, scenographers, costume designers, stage management. I mean, really, some of the images that we saw on stage, and some of the scenography that was developed by Luigi Farina, for example, absolutely stunning, and a wonderful team. I can't say that I had my hands on any of that. I was certainly aware of what they were creating, and I guess I was in the discussion. But look, I tend to agree, I suppose, with the premise of what you said. An opera it starts with the score, and of course it ends with what is staged. So, and as I said before, it's a 360-degree storytelling mechanism. So I guess knowing that that what was being created was influenced by the score itself, and the music that that I had delivered in early 23, I think it was. That was also really amazing to see what they were inspired to do based on what they had heard. So I didn't feel like I needed to put my hands on anything, because I knew that these wonderful talents, and I'm a big fan of let the experts do what they're good at. And I'm certainly not expert at any of those things. So to know that they were influenced or inspired by the music that they were hearing, I feel like that's the best kind of influence I could have on those elements. So certainly didn't feel like I needed to push into anything. And of course, we were all there together. I can say from feedback of some of our cast and musicians in the orchestra and the chorus, and many of the technical crew, this was a very unique experience, I think, for most of us. You expect in productions for there to be conflict and trauma and all of these kinds of things when you have, especially with singers, for example, like singers, it's a very difficult thing. So you can have really complex personalities coming into contact with one another, and sometimes it's not a happy time. But there really was, I mean, there was none of that on this production. I remember a particular moment in our first rehearsal period in Brno in the Czech Republic. We did a run through with our two casts and the chorus and the repetiteurs, and it was the first time that everybody had heard the work from start to finish. And as the piece came to a conclusion, the room just erupted into cheers and applause, and it went on for minutes. And everybody was hugging and crying, and it just, that experience, I think, bonded particularly the musical cohort, and that seemed to infiltrate the entire team. So once we got to Saudi, and of course the technical team had been working together, and they've worked on many things together for many, many years. So they have a strong bond in and amongst themselves. But I guess that spirit, it seemed to infiltrate everything. And look, it's not to say that there wasn't disagreements and things like that, but it was a very collaborative and happy time for most people, I think.
After the premiere of the opera, has there been talk about what's going to happen next in Saudi Arabia with opera?
Well, they are building 2 opera houses that I'm aware of, and I think there's maybe going to be a third. There's one in Diriyah and another one in Jeddah. And it's my understanding that those 2 venues will be opened with this work. And of course, the ministry are very keen to see the opera performed in the West. So that's an ongoing that's an ongoing process and discussion. And of course, in my mind, from the very get-go, it was something that I very strongly hoped would find its way into the West, so that Western audiences could not only hear the work, of course, but to come to know the story, and to hear the language sung operatically, and to see that that this is something that we achieved. So yeah, the other aspect of Zarqa being one of the flagship projects of the Ministry of Culture was that young Saudis would actually see that, okay, opera making is something that is available to them, and that Zarqa would be, I suppose, the catalyst for the instantiation of education systems and teaching academies for the training of classical music and in particular opera. So that is, again, it's not something that's ever going to happen overnight, but given the success of the work and the success of the production, that certainly points toward that being a positive and possible flow on.
Well, many thanks, Mr. Bradshaw, for.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely to speak with you, and it's great that people are still talking about this project everywhere. Places like Mexico, I never would have imagined. Amazing.
Yes. Well, many thanks, and see you in the next edition of Opera Notes.
Thank you very much.